here in an exhibition called Landscape in Motion in the KUNSTHAUS GRAZ. Landscape in Motion wants to define landscape as something that is in motion and that sets us in motion, basically. Landscape has never been something stable, although we can see it as being a construction. Landscape is not something that we see if we look outside of the window. Landscape is something that we only see as a construction of images that we produce through films, through painting, for instance. If we think of landscape, we usually think of a romantic painting. But today we live in a time and age where landscape is not anymore romantic, where landscape becomes more and more industrialized, where we can see that mankind has actually been developing his own or her own landscape by his use of landscape as human resource. Landscape, therefore, has always to be seen as something that is in direct relation to humankind and to the use through the human perception, in a way. What we're doing here is we have an exhibition that is dealing with this idea of the construction of landscape that we have as a landscape that is in constant motion, that is defined by motion, where we can see also, of course, the technical inventions that were done during the 20th century as a speed up of this motion, which lead us to industrialized landscapes as we have never seen before. The term Anthropocene is maybe something that we have to deal with also in here. If we think about landscape today, we know that it is a global scale. We cannot look out of the window and landscape is only what we see, as I said, but landscape is actually defined by a global situation where use of cement on the one side demands sand from the other side of our global sphere. So we can see that the landscape surrounding us is actually this ending, this world that we see as an ending sphere of a resource of life for every one of us. So what we have here are works that deal with this idea, with this technologically used landscape around us that is defined by us and that can be seen as a construction to do with powers in the background, political powers, with historical interests, with interest, of course, also of image making. The exhibition starts with a wonderful work by Lucius Bruckhardt. Lucius Bruckhardt was an urbanist in the 80s, especially. He was active in the German-speaking world and around Kassel, where he taught his students something very important: to move in landscape and to deconstruct landscape by the own movement. So he went out with his students of urbanism, rather than studying books and looking at the development of urban structures. He said that the immediate landscape outside is to be seen by experience. So he went out with his students and actually moved through this landscape, and so the first work we have is his walking stick that asks us also, us and the visitors, to walk through these landscapes that artists have found. we can see a general interest in landscape as material, starting with maybe around Robert Smithson, and this is also the earliest artistic position that we have in the exhibition. Robert Smithson's work of the spiral jetty that has become the icon maybe of land art. So we start with this work where the landscape actually becomes a sculptural material where bulldozers actually play an important role. So the industrialized technical advancements of the 20th century have actually created this fantastic piece of art that can be seen from very far above, where we again have this vision of the whole world as being the landscape, that we have to deal with. So Robert Smithson is probably the first who combines conceptual art with a form of looking at landscape as the metaphor of a sort of an endless but constantly changing life. This change being a very important factor in all of these works. So if we look at for instance, an artist group coming from California, CLUI, Center of Land Use Investigation is their full name. They develop this look, this nearly scientific look at a landscape that is in constant change, where industrial sites become, in a way, like Smithson's sculptures, but they actually are not produced as artworks, but they are becoming artworks just by this vision of from above, where we can see that human work becomes actually a new structure shaping our landscape that defines us, shaping our surroundings in a very sculptural way. Or, for instance, I'm standing in front of Shigeo Rui's camera obscura work. This camera obscura again defines, of course, time. We're having here an image that is shot over the period of 8 hours. So actually a very fast, if we think of the size of the image, development of landscape in front of our eye, but then also a slow construction of a photograph that is actually showing us time in a way. So Shigeo Rui's work is looking here, pointing his direction at the certainly most famous mountain. It's the Mount Everest that we see in the background there as an icon, of course, of landscape per se. So here we get probably closest to a romantic aspect of landscape, as also part of the construction of this term landscape in our mind. Whenever we think of landscape, of course, there is this idea of a romantic situation, an emotional situation where we stand in relation to. But landscape, if we think about landscape as a construction, we also, of course, think of language and how language influences this construction of landscape in itself. And their narration plays an important role. So other works, like the work by a group of Austrian artists, Leopold Kalice and Gerhard Tremel, look at the idea of landscape as a construction, a cinematic construction, where, of course, the influence of cinema is highly visible. When we think of landscapes that we all know, for instance, the Californian deserts, we all know how they look. Of course, not by actually having been there, maybe some of us have, but others, we all know how they must feel, because the cinema and the invention of film, of course, has brought us these landscapes as being part of our own memory, as being part of a model idea of landscape that we have. So, in the time of age of the Anthropocene, where we see that landscape is becoming something where we have to look at, where we take the responsibility for, these works deal with this idea between responsibility and actually a development of its own, because, as I say, landscape in motion, of course, also means that this motion is maybe somehow slightly out of our control.